August 1944. Over the Baltic Sea. A lone reconnaissance Mosquito streaks toward Soviet-controlled airspace at 400 miles per hour. The pilot sees two contrails rising fast from the east. MiG interceptors. Closing angle suggests 90 seconds to gun range. His navigator calls altitude and bearing but offers no solution. There is no solution. Then the pilot does something no manual describes. He kicks full left rudder while holding the stick neutral. The aircraft skids sideways through the sky. The radar signature vanishes. The interceptors overshoot. Years later, intelligence analysts will argue whether what happened next was luck, madness, or the single most important evasive innovation of the photo-reconnaissance war. The summer of 1944 marks a strange paradox in the air war over Europe. Allied bombers own the daylight, fighters rule the transit corridors. But in the high frontier, above 30,000 feet, alone, unarmed, racing against fuel and oxygen, the photo-reconnaissance pilot flies a different war entirely. No gunner, no formation, no second chance. The de Havilland Mosquito is the instrument of that solitude. Built of balsa and plywood, powered by twin Rolls-Royce Merlins, it is fast enough to outrun most fighters and light enough to climb where few can follow. Its cameras capture airfields, rail yards, troop movements. Every sortie feeds the vast calculus of invasion planning and strategic bombing. But speed and altitude are not armor, and by mid-1944, German and Soviet radar networks have learned to see what once moved unseen. The Baltics present a unique problem. Reconnaissance missions over Riga, Tallinn, and Königsberg require penetration of both German and Soviet airspace. The political reality is delicate. The operational reality is lethal. Soviet interceptors do not ask questions. Their standing orders are to destroy unidentified aircraft, regardless of markings. The Allies know this. The pilots know this. Yet the missions continue because the intelligence is irreplaceable. Flight Lieutenant James Archibald Byrne, known as Archie to his squadron, flies out of RAF Benson in Oxfordshire. He is 26 years old. Before the war, he worked as a surveyor in Lancashire, measuring gradients and calculating loads for railway bridges. The work taught him geometry, patience, and an obsessive respect for angles. His logbook shows 217 operational hours. He does not speak much. His ground crew appreciate this. Quiet pilots tend to return. On the morning of August 14th, Byrne is briefed for a deep reconnaissance run over the Gulf of Finland. The target is a suspected forward airfield near Narva. The route takes him north over the Baltic, then east along the coast, threading the gap between German flak batteries on the islands and Soviet radar stations on the mainland. Weather is clear. Visibility unlimited, the kind of day that makes you visible from 30 miles. He takes off at 0600 hours. The Mosquito climbs steeply, engines throttled back to cruising power once altitude is reached. At 32,000 feet, the air is thin and bitterly cold. Frost forms on the canopy edges. Byrne's oxygen mask hisses with each breath. Below, the Baltic is a slate mirror. No clouds, no cover. The first pass over the target area is textbook. Cameras rolling. He banks gently, maintaining speed, then turns southwest for the return leg. That is when his navigator, Sergeant Peter Hollis, calls out the contrails. Two of them, rising fast from an airfield near Tallinn. Vector suggests interception in less than 2 minutes. Byrne does not panic. Panic is inefficient. He pushes the throttles forward and begins a shallow dive to build speed. The Mosquito accelerates smoothly, 410 miles per hour. 420. But the contrails continue to rise. The interceptors are not German. Intelligence later confirms they are Yak-9s, flown by Soviet pilots under orders to defend the airspace at any cost. Standard doctrine is simple: outrun them. The Mosquito is faster in level flight and can outdive almost anything. But these pilots are experienced. They are climbing to altitude before committing to the chase. Once they level out, the geometry changes. If burn runs straight, they will have a brief window, perhaps 20 seconds, where closure rate and gun range intersect. 20 seconds is enough. Hollis suggests heading west toward the nearest Allied corridor. Byrne considers it. But the math is wrong. They are too far east. By the time they reach safe airspace, fuel will be marginal, and the interceptors will have closed the gap, so Byrne does something else. He kicks the left rudder pedal to the floor while holding the control column nearly neutral. The Mosquito does not turn. It skids. The nose yaws violently to the left while the aircraft continues to fly in roughly the same direction. The fuselage presents its full-side profile to the airstream. Drag multiplies, speed decays. But something else happens. The radar return changes. A normal aircraft reflects radar energy predictably. The returns form a consistent blip, updated every sweep. But an aircraft in a skid, fuselage canted, control surfaces deflected, airflow chaotic, scatters radar energy in unpredictable directions. The blip weakens. In some cases, it vanishes entirely for several seconds, long enough for the radar operator to lose track, long enough for the interceptor pilot, relying on ground control, to lose the geometry of the chase. Byrne holds the skid for 8 seconds. Then he releases the rudder, centers the aircraft, and rolls into a shallow dive. The Mosquito accelerates again. Hollis watches through the canopy. The contrails sweep past to the north, overshooting by nearly a mile. The interceptors do not correct. They continue on their original vector, searching for a target that no longer matches their radar picture. Byrne levels out at 28,000 feet and continues southwest. His fuel state is acceptable. His hands are steady. Hollis does not speak for several minutes. Then he asks how Byrne knew that would work. Byrne does not answer immediately. Later, in the debriefing room at Benson, he will explain his reasoning. The rudder skid was something he had experimented with months earlier, trying to understand how the Mosquito handled in uncoordinated flight. He noticed that the aircraft felt, he used the word smudged, as though it occupied more space than it should. He wondered if that smudging might extend beyond aerodynamics, if it might confuse not just the air, but the interpretation of the air. He did not know it would work. He simply knew the alternative was worse. If this history matters to you, tap like and subscribe. James Byrne's path to the cockpit was not typical. He did not grow up dreaming of flight. As a boy in Preston, he was more interested in theodolites than aeroplanes. His father was a civil engineer. His mother kept the accounts for a textile mill. Both valued precision. Dinner conversations revolved around tolerances, materials, and the consequences of small errors compounded over distance. Byrne joined the RAF in 1940, not out of patriotism, but out of logic. The war would consume young men regardless of preference. Better to choose the service than be chosen by it. His aptitude scores were high, his spatial reasoning exceptional. He was selected for pilot training and sent to Canada under the Commonwealth Air Training Plan. He learned to fly on Tiger Moths, then Harvards. His instructors noted that he flew with unusual smoothness, no wasted motion, no overcorrection. He treated the aircraft like a system to be understood rather than a machine to be fought. When he returned to England in 1942, he was assigned to a reconnaissance squadron. It suited him. Reconnaissance required patience, navigation skill, and the ability to operate alone. By 1944, Byrne had flown missions over France, the Low Countries, and Germany. He had been shot at, chased, and once forced to land with one engine feathered after flak severed an oil line. He did not speak of these events except in the dry language of after-action reports. But his ground crew noticed small things. He always walked around the aircraft before every flight, checking surfaces, rivets, control cables. He never rushed. His navigator, Peter Hollis, was different. Hollis had been a schoolteacher in Dorset before the war. He loved maps the way some men loved poetry. He could recite coordinates from memory and calculate drift corrections in his head. He trusted Byrne because Byrne never lied about risk. If a mission was dangerous, Byrne said so. If it was survivable, he explained how. The two men flew together for 11 months before the incident over the Baltic. In that time, they completed 43 operational sorties. They developed a rhythm. Hollis managed navigation and communication. Byrne managed everything else. They did not socialize off-duty. This was not coldness. It was respect for the odds. By the summer of 1944, the reconnaissance war has encountered a new problem. The problem is radar. Early in the war, photo reconnaissance aircraft relied on altitude and speed. If you flew high enough and fast enough, interception was unlikely. Fighters struggled to climb to 30,000 feet with enough fuel and performance remaining to engage. And even if they reached altitude, spotting a lone mosquito in a vast sky was a matter of luck. But radar changed the equation. Ground-based radar could detect aircraft at ranges exceeding 50 miles. Controllers could vector interceptors onto targets with precision, eliminating the need for visual search. The hunter no longer needed to see. He only needed instructions. The Allies were aware of this development. Intelligence reports from late 1943 indicated that both German and Soviet air defense networks were becoming increasingly effective. Losses among reconnaissance aircraft began to climb, not dramatically, but enough to notice, enough to matter. Doctrine evolved slowly. Pilots were instructed to vary altitude and routing, to avoid predictable patterns, to use weather and cloud cover when available. But these measures were reactive. They reduced risk. They did not eliminate it. What frustrated commanders was the lack of a technical solution. Radar could not be jammed without betraying the aircraft's position. Chaff was effective for bomber streams, but impractical for lone reconnaissance aircraft. Speed remained the primary defense, but speed had limits. The Mosquito could outrun most fighters, but not all, and even a brief engagement could result in damage, fuel loss, or mission failure. Some pilots began experimenting with evasive maneuvers, tight turns, sudden dives, anything to break the tracking solution. But these maneuvers cost speed and altitude, the very assets that kept reconnaissance aircraft alive. And they were only effective after the interceptor was already close. By then, the odds were poor. Byrne read the intelligence summaries. He attended the briefings. He understood the problem intellectually, but understanding a problem is not the same as solving it. And solutions, he believed, rarely emerged from theory alone. They emerged from noticing something small, something everyone else ignored. The moment that led to Byrne's innovation occurred 6 weeks before the Baltic mission. He was conducting a low-level test flight over Oxfordshire, evaluating a new camera mount. The weather was turbulent. Gusty crosswinds required constant rudder corrections to maintain heading. At one point, Byrne applied too much rudder. The Mosquito yawed sharply. Instead of correcting immediately, he held the input for a few seconds, curious about how the aircraft would respond. The fuselage slewed through the air, nose pointed 15 degrees off the flight path. The sensation was unsettling. The aircraft felt heavy, imprecise, as though it were dragging something invisible. When he landed, he mentioned the experience to his crew chief, a veteran mechanic named Arthur Greaves. Greaves asked if anything had been damaged. Byrne said no. Greaves shrugged and returned to his work. But the sensation stayed with Byrne, that feeling of the aircraft smudging through space. A week later, he requested permission to conduct a series of handling tests. His squadron commander approved, assuming Byrne was investigating a control issue. In truth, Byrne wanted to understand what happened to the Mosquito during uncoordinated flight. He climbed to 20,000 feet and began a series of rudder skids, deliberate, sustained yaw inputs with minimal bank. Each time, the aircraft responded the same way. Speed decayed, drag increased, but the behavior was not chaotic. It was predictable. He could hold the skid, then recover smoothly. He could vary the intensity. He could, in effect, modulate how much the aircraft smudged. He did not yet connect this to radar. That insight came later, during a conversation with a signals officer who had transferred from radar research. The officer mentioned, almost in passing, that radar returns were cleanest when the target presented a stable, predictable profile. Anything that disrupted that profile, turbulence, jinking, even heavy control inputs, could degrade the return. Byrne asked if a sustained yaw would have the same effect. The officer said it might, but cautioned that no pilot would deliberately fly out of trim in combat. It would cost too much speed, too much control. The risk outweighed any theoretical benefit. Byrne did not argue, but he did not agree either. He submitted a brief technical note to his squadron intelligence officer outlining the concept. The note was polite, methodical, and largely ignored. Reconnaissance pilots were expected to fly missions, not theorize about radar physics. The note was filed. No follow-up was requested. Byrne did not push the matter. He simply continued flying. And he continued thinking. The mission on August 14th gave him no time to think, only to act. When the Yak-9s began their climb, Byrne had perhaps 90 seconds before they reached firing position. He could see their contrails stitching upward through the clear air. Hollis called bearings and estimated closure rate. The geometry was unfavorable. Running straight would not work. Turning would bleed speed and allow the interceptors to cut the angle. A dive might work, but it would take him lower, closer to flak zones, and burn fuel he could not spare. So he gambled. He firewalled the throttles first, building as much speed as possible. 415 miles per hour, 425. The Mosquito vibrated as it neared its structural limits. Then, at the moment when the interceptors should have been finalizing their attack run, Byrne stomped the left rudder pedal to the floor. The nose yawed violently. The horizon tilted. The aircraft did not turn in the traditional sense. It skidded, tail swinging wide, fuselage canted nearly 30 degrees off the flight path. Drag spiked. Speed began to decay immediately. The control column fought him, airframe shuddering under the uncoordinated load. Hollis braced against the instrument panel, unsure whether they had been hit. Byrne held the skid for 8 seconds, long enough for the radar picture to fracture, long enough for the ground controller to lose confidence in the return, long enough for the interceptors, depending entirely on vectored guidance, to commit to a pursuit path that no longer matched reality. Then Byrne released the rudder, centered the controls, and rolled gently into a shallow dive. The Mosquito accelerated smoothly. The interceptors, now nearly a mile to the north, continued on their original heading. They did not correct. They did not re-engage. Within 30 seconds, they were out of visual range. Byrne leveled at 28,000 feet and resumed course. He checked fuel, checked instruments. Everything normal. Hollis asked what had just happened. Byrne said he had tried something. Hollis asked if it had worked. Byrne said it seemed to. The flight back to Benson was uneventful. They landed just after 1000 hours. The debriefing took longer than usual. Byrne described the encounter in his characteristic flat tone. He explained the rudder input, the skid, the result. The intelligence officer asked if Byrne believed the maneuver had actually defeated radar, or if the interceptors had simply lost visual contact. Byrne said he did not know for certain, but he noted that the visibility had been unlimited. The Mosquito's contrail would have been visible for miles. The interceptors had not lost sight of him. They had lost the information that told them where to look. The intelligence officer made notes but offered no opinion. Byrne was thanked and dismissed. He walked back to the flight line, where Greaves was inspecting the Mosquito for damage. Greaves asked how the mission went. Byrne said it went fine. Greaves nodded and continued his inspection. 2 days later, Byrne was summoned to a meeting with the squadron commander and a visiting officer from the RAF's Air Fighting Development Unit. The visitor introduced himself as Wing Commander Trent. He had read Byrne's debriefing. He had questions. Trent wanted to know if Byrne could repeat the maneuver. Byrne said yes. Trent wanted to know if it could be taught. Byrne said he believed so, but that it required precise rudder control and a willingness to accept temporary loss of speed. Trent asked if Byrne had tested the maneuver under different conditions. Byrne said he had experimented with it during handling tests, but never under operational pressure until the Baltic mission. Trent leaned back and considered this. Then he said he wanted to observe a demonstration, a controlled flight with radar tracking and analysis. If Byrne was correct, if the maneuver genuinely degraded radar returns, it could have significant implications for reconnaissance operations and possibly for bomber evasion tactics. Byrne agreed. The demonstration was scheduled for August 22nd at RAF Defford, home to the Telecommunications Research Establishment. A Mosquito was fitted with tracking equipment. Ground radar units were tasked to monitor the flight. Byrne was instructed to climb to 30,000 feet, establish a stable course, and then execute the rudder skid, while radar operators recorded the returns. He took off at 1400 hours. The weather was clear. Calm air, ideal conditions for precise measurement. He climbed to altitude and established a heading of due north at 400 miles per hour. The radar locked on immediately. Byrne held course for 2 minutes, allowing the operators to establish a baseline. Then he applied full left rudder. The Mosquito yawed hard. The skid was sharper than during the Baltic mission because the air was smooth. No turbulence to soften the input. The fuselage swung through a 30-degree angle. Speed decayed rapidly. Byrne held the skid for 10 seconds, then recovered and resumed level flight. On the ground, the radar operators reviewed the recording. The results were unambiguous. During the skid, the radar return weakened significantly. In some sweeps, it disappeared entirely. The effect lasted for the duration of the maneuver and briefly afterward as the turbulence dissipated. The operators estimated that a tracking radar would lose lock for anywhere from 5 to 12 seconds, depending on system sensitivity and operator experience. 12 seconds might not sound significant, but in air combat, where interception geometry depends on continuous tracking, 12 seconds is an eternity. It is enough time to alter heading, to dive, to disappear into a new vector before the radar reacquires. Wing Commander Trent authorized further testing. Over the next 3 weeks, Byrne and 2 other experienced Mosquito pilots flew a series of evaluation flights. The maneuver was refined. Optimal rudder deflection was determined. Recovery techniques were standardized. Training notes were drafted. By mid-September, the rudder skid, officially termed the uncoordinated yaw evasion, was incorporated into reconnaissance pilot training. It was taught not as a primary defense, but as a last resort tactic when speed and altitude alone were insufficient. The maneuver required practice. It was uncomfortable. It felt wrong. But it worked. The impact of Burns' innovation was not immediately dramatic. It did not change the course of the war. It did not result in headlines or medals, but it changed the odds. And in reconnaissance, where margins were always thin, changing the odds meant saving lives. Between September 1944 and the end of the war in Europe, 23 Mosquito reconnaissance pilots filed reports crediting the rudder skid with evading interception. Not all cases involved radar. Some involved visual pursuit in clear air, where the sudden loss of predictable motion confused the attacker just long enough to create separation. But in at least 14 documented cases, pilots reported that radar-directed interceptors overshot or broke off after the maneuver was executed. One pilot flying over the Ruhr in October used the skid twice in the same mission. He was pursued by 2 separate fighters, each vectored onto him by ground radar. Both times, the skid caused the interceptor to overshoot. He returned to base with his cameras intact and his fuel nearly exhausted. His debrief noted that without the maneuver, he would have had no option but to dive into flak range or accept engagement. Another pilot, operating over Norway in January 1945, credited the skid with allowing him to evade a German jet, an Me-262. The jet was faster than any Mosquito, but when the pilot executed the rudder skid, the Me-262's radar-assisted gun sight lost lock. The jet pilot, unaccustomed to targets that behaved unpredictably, overshot and did not re-engage. The reconnaissance pilot completed his mission and returned safely. These accounts filtered back to RAF Benson and other reconnaissance units. The maneuver earned a quiet reputation. It was not celebrated. It was simply known. Pilots who flew alone, unarmed, into hostile airspace added it to their repertoire. It became part of the unspoken knowledge that separated those who survived from those who did not. The technical community took note as well. Radar engineers studied the phenomenon. They determined that the skid disrupted not only the radar return, but also the Doppler signature used by some tracking systems. The chaotic airflow around the fuselage created micro-turbulence that scattered electromagnetic energy unpredictably. The effect was temporary, but repeatable. Some engineers proposed developing an active countermeasure based on the same principle, a device that could artificially create turbulence or alter the aircraft's radar profile. But the war ended before such systems moved beyond theory. The rudder skid remained a human solution, a pilot's tool. Born from observation, refined through practice, proven in desperation. James Byrne survived the war. He flew his final operational mission in April 1945, a reconnaissance run over northern Germany. The war in Europe ended 3 weeks later. He was demobilized in early 1946 and returned to Lancashire. He resumed his work as a surveyor. He did not speak often about his wartime service. In 1952, he was invited to a reunion of reconnaissance pilots at RAF Benson. He attended. The event was informal. Men who had flown alone over enemy territory, who had trusted speed and altitude and sometimes luck, gathered to remember those who had not returned. Burns spoke briefly with Peter Hollis, his navigator. Hollis had become a schoolteacher again. They shook hands. They did not need to say much. Years later, after Burns' death in 1987, his logbook and a small collection of papers were donated to the RAF Museum. Among them was the original technical note he had submitted in 1944, outlining the concept of using uncoordinated flight to disrupt radar tracking. The note was 2 pages long, handwritten, methodical. It bore no signatures of approval, no stamps of authorization. Just a quiet proposal from a pilot who noticed something others had missed. The rudder skid was never officially credited to Byrne. It appeared in training manuals without attribution. It was taught as a technique, not as an invention. This did not bother him. He had not sought recognition, he had sought a solution. In the decades after the war, as radar technology advanced and evasion tactics grew more sophisticated, the rudder skid became obsolete. Modern systems could track through turbulence, through chaff, through maneuvers far more extreme than a simple yaw. But for a brief window in 1944 and 1945, in the thin air above hostile territory, it worked. It gave pilots an option when they had none. It turned a moment of desperation into a moment of control. Byrne's legacy is not in the manuals or the reports. It is in the 23 men who came home because they knew what to do when the radar locked on and the interceptors climbed. It is in the understanding that courage is not always loud, that innovation does not always announce itself, that sometimes the difference between survival and loss is a single, unorthodox decision made by someone who refused to accept that the problem was unsolvable. He was a surveyor who measured angles, a pilot who trusted geometry, a man who, when the odds were impossible, kicked the rudder and bet on physics. The sky did not care about doctrine, it cared about what worked. And for a moment in the summer of 1944, what worked was something no one had thought to try. Until he did. March 1945. A flight of Allied bombers, bleeding fuel and riddled with flak, descends into German-held airspace with no altitude to spare. The lead pilot is unconscious. The co-pilot is 19 years old, barely 3 months out of training, and has never landed under fire. In the next 90 seconds, he will either become a footnote in a casualty report or rewrite the manual on what one person can do when every system fails. What he does next defies every instructor who doubted him. The winter of early 1945 stretches cold and unforgiving across the European theater. Snow dusts the runways of American bomber bases scattered throughout England and liberated France. The air smells of oil, exhaust, and damp wool. Briefing rooms echo with the scrape of chairs and the low rumble of men too tired to joke anymore. By now, the war has been grinding forward for years. The Allies are pushing into Germany from the west. The Soviets press from the east. But victory is not clean. It is purchased in aluminum and blood, sortie by sortie, mission by grinding mission. The bomber war demands precision. Formations of B-17s and B-24s cross enemy lines in daylight, flying through curtains of flak and swarms of Luftwaffe interceptors. The logic is simple. Destroy the factories, the fuel depots, the rail yards, cripple the infrastructure, starve the war machine. But simplicity ends at the briefing table. Once airborne, everything becomes chaos. Engines fail, oxygen systems freeze, fighters tear through formations like scissors through silk, anti-aircraft fire bursts in black clouds that rattle teeth and punch through wings. Men bleed out at 20,000 feet, too high and too cold for mercy. The crews are young. Most are still in their teens or early 20s. They come from farms in Iowa, factories in Detroit, classrooms in Pennsylvania. They learn to fly heavy machines in a matter of months. Then they are thrust into the sky over hostile territory with 10 other lives depending on their judgment. Some adapt quickly. They become the confident ones, the natural pilots who seem born with a stick in their hands. Others are quieter. They do their jobs, follow orders, stay out of the way. They are competent but unremarkable. They do not draw attention. Second Lieutenant James Calloway falls into the latter category. He arrives at his assigned unit in late 1944, fresh from stateside training. His records show solid marks, but nothing exceptional. His instructors note that he is methodical, sometimes slow to react, and overly cautious during simulated emergencies. One evaluation reads, lacks confidence under pressure, needs encouragement. Another, technically sound but hesitant, unsuited for command roles. He does not argue with these assessments. He keeps his head down. He listens more than he speaks. In the barracks, the other men joke and argue and gamble away their pay. Calloway reads technical manuals. He sketches diagrams of hydraulic systems and engine schematics in a worn notebook. He asks the crew chiefs questions about trim settings and fuel management that most pilots never bother with. The flight engineers tolerate him. The other pilots mostly ignore him. He is assigned as a co-pilot on a B-24 Liberator, a position that requires competence but rarely demands brilliance. His job is to assist, to monitor, to be a backup. He does it quietly. His pilot, Captain Robert Hale, is everything Calloway is not. Hale is 24, but carries himself like a man a decade older. He has flown 32 missions. He laughs easily, drinks hard, and flies with an edge of recklessness that his crew interprets as confidence. They trust him because he always brings them home. Hale does not trust Calloway. Not yet. To him, the shy co-pilot is a liability waiting to happen, someone who will freeze when the moment demands action. Hale does not say this aloud, but Calloway can feel it in the way orders are delivered, in the brief glances during pre-flight checks. It is the quiet judgment of a man who has seen too many hesitations turn fatal. Calloway does not resent this. He simply works. He double-checks fuel calculations. He memorizes emergency procedures until they play in his sleep. He studies the terrain maps, the weather reports, the debriefings from other crews. He absorbs everything. On the morning of March 14, 1945, the mission briefing is routine. The target is a synthetic oil refinery near Leipzig, deep inside Germany. Intelligence reports moderate flak and possible fighter activity. The weather is expected to be overcast but manageable. The formation will consist of 18 bombers, escorted partway by P-51 Mustangs. Hale's crew boards their B-24, tail number 427563, nicknamed Lucky Streak, by a crew that flew her before them. The name is fading now, barely visible under layers of grime and patches. Calloway settles into the right seat. He runs through his checklist with mechanical precision. Engine start, gauge check, flap setting, trim adjustment. The engines cough, then roar to life. The airframe shudders. Frost cracks and slides off the wings as the propellers spin up. One by one, the bombers taxi toward the runway. They lift off just after dawn. The sky is pale gray, heavy with clouds. The formation climbs, tightening into a defensive box. The Mustangs join them at 10,000 feet, sleek and fast, weaving above the lumbering bombers like sheepdogs around a flock. For 2 hours the mission proceeds without incident. The cloud cover thickens, the temperature drops. Ice begins to form on the windscreen. Calloway watches the instruments, calling out readings every few minutes. Hale nods, but says little. Then the flak starts. It begins as distant black puffs, almost decorative. Then it tightens. The gunners on the ground have the range now. Explosions bloom closer, louder. Shrapnel pings against the fuselage. One burst rocks the plane hard to the left. Hale fights the yoke, bringing her level again. A voice crackles over the intercom. "Number 3 engine hit. Oil pressure dropping." Hale feathers the prop, shutting down the damaged engine. The bomber loses speed, begins to drift back from the formation. The other planes pull ahead. Then the fighters come. 2 Focke-Wulf 190s, gray ghosts against gray clouds. They dive from above, cannon fire stitching across the wing. The waist gunners return fire, tracers lacing the sky. One fighter peels away, the other presses in. A burst strikes the cockpit, the plexiglass spiderwebs. Wind screams through the opening. Hale jerks violently, then slumps forward against his harness. Calloway reaches for him, shouts his name. No response. Blood spreads dark across Hale's jacket. The bomber begins to nose down. If you want more such stories, like and subscribe so these lives aren't forgotten. Time does not slow. That is a myth. But focus narrows. The world collapses to a series of decisions, each one demanding immediate action. Calloway pulls Hale back from the controls. The captain's weight is dead, his hands slack. There is no time to check vitals, no time to call for the navigator or bombardier to help. The bomber is diving, picking up speed, the altimeter unwinding fast. Calloway grabs the yoke with both hands. He pulls. The plane resists, momentum and gravity conspiring against him. His arms burn. The nose rises, slowly, grudgingly. The dive flattens into a shallow descent. He levels off at 14,000 feet. His breath comes hard and fast, fogging the cold air inside the shattered cockpit. Wind howls through the broken glass. Ice crystals sting his face. He keys the intercom. His voice is steadier than he expects. "Pilot incapacitated. I have control. Damage report." The responses come in fragments. Number 3, engine out. Number 2, running rough. Hydraulics compromised. Left stabilizer damaged. Fuel leaking from the main tank. They are alone now. The formation is gone, vanished into the clouds ahead. The fighters have broken off, perhaps hunting easier prey. The bomber limbs through hostile sky, losing altitude, losing fuel, losing time. The navigator's voice crackles through. "We're 60 miles inside enemy territory. Heading 270 puts us back toward friendly lines, but we won't make it on 2 engines with this damage." Calloway scans the horizon. Below, through breaks in the clouds, he sees the patchwork of fields and villages, the dark lines of roads and rail. All of it enemy ground. The bombardier suggests bailing out. They still have altitude. They could scatter, take their chances on foot. Some might evade capture. Calloway considers this. 9 men aboard, some wounded. The radio operator took shrapnel in the leg. The tail gunner is unconscious, maybe dead. Bailing out means leaving them. He makes the decision without drama. "We're staying with the ship. Prepare for emergency landing." No one argues. Perhaps they trust him. Perhaps they simply have no better option. He begins a shallow turn westward. The engines groan. The airframe shudders. Every control input feels sluggish, as if the plane itself is dying by degrees. They descend through 10,000 feet, then 8, then 6. The clouds thin. The ground rises to meet them, no longer abstract, but immediate. He can see individual trees now, the rooftops of barns, the glint of a frozen stream. The navigator calls out landmarks, trying to orient them. They are over farmland, somewhere south of the main combat lines. No safe airfield within range. No flat ground visible. Calloway's mind runs through options with mechanical speed. Wheels up landing in a field, risky with damaged hydraulics and uneven terrain. Trying to gain altitude and head for Allied lines. Impossible with their fuel state and engine condition. Attempting to reach neutral territory. 2 show far. Then he sees it. A stretch of road, straight and wide, cutting through a valley. It is not long, perhaps half a mile. It is not empty. A convoy of German trucks is moving along it, headed south. But it is the only option. He tells the crew to brace. He does not explain the plan because there is no time and no alternative. He drops the landing gear manually, cranking the handle until his shoulders scream. The gear locks with a thud he feels more than hears. The road rushes up. He lines up the approach, fighting crosswind and the plane's tendency to drift left. The trucks scatter, pulling off into the ditches. Soldiers pour out, scattering into the fields. Some raise rifles. Calloway ignores them. He focuses on the pavement, on the airspeed, on the angle of descent. Too steep, and they will cartwheel. Too shallow, and they will overshoot into the tree line. He cuts power to the remaining engines. The bomber drops. The wheels kiss the road surface, bounce hard, slam down again. The fuselage shrieks as metal scrapes pavement. The left tire blows. The plane yaws violently. He fights it, using rudder and brakes, dragging the crippled machine straight. They slide for 300 yards. The right wing clips a telephone pole, spinning them 15 degrees. The tail swings around. Then, finally, they stop. Silence. For a moment, no one moves. Then the intercom erupts with voices. Someone is laughing. Someone is praying. Someone is screaming for the medic. Calloway unbuckles, stumbles out of his seat. His hands are shaking now, the adrenaline catching up. He moves through the fuselage, checking faces, counting heads. 8 men alive. The tail gunner did not make it. Through the broken windows he sees German soldiers approaching, weapons raised but not firing. There is nowhere to run. They are deep in enemy territory, surrounded, their plane a smoking wreck on a country road. The crew begins to raise their hands. The war, for them, is over. But they are alive. All of them who could be saved. Prisoner of war camps are not the subject of this story. What matters is what came after, or rather, what came to light afterward. The crew of Lucky Streak spent the final weeks of the war in a Luftwaffe run facility near Nuremberg. Conditions were grim, but not brutal. The German guards, many of them older men or boys too young for the front, were exhausted and increasingly aware that the war was lost. They processed the new prisoners with bureaucratic efficiency and little malice. Calloway shared a barracks with 30 other captured airmen. They passed the days playing cards, sharing Red Cross parcels, and listening to distant artillery that grew louder each week. No one knew exactly when liberation would come, only that it was inevitable. During those weeks, Calloway spoke little about the emergency landing. When the other prisoners asked, he described it in technical terms: airspeed, angle of descent, control surface response. He did not frame it as heroism. To him, it was a problem that required a solution. He had found the only viable one. But the crew of Lucky Streak did not see it that way. They talked among themselves, reconstructing the sequence of events. The navigator calculated that they had been descending at a rate that would have put them into the ground in under 2 minutes. The bombardier remembered the way Calloway had cranked the landing gear down manually, a task that usually required 2 men. The radio operator, still limping from his shrapnel wound, recalled the calm voice on the intercom, giving orders without hesitation. They began to understand what had happened. Their quiet, unremarkable co-pilot had done something extraordinary, and he had done it alone. In late April, American forces overran the camp. The prisoners were loaded onto trucks and driven west, back across the lines they had once bombed from above. They were debriefed, examined, and processed. Most were sent home within weeks. Calloway returned to the United States in May 1945. The war in Europe was over. Japan would surrender 3 months later. He was discharged with the rest of the wartime pilots, his service record noting 1 emergency landing under combat conditions. There was no medal, no ceremony. The Air Force was demobilizing millions. Paperwork was lost. Stories went untold. He went back to Ohio. He finished a degree in mechanical engineering. He married. He took a job with an aircraft manufacturer, working in design and testing. He did not talk about the war, but the story did not end there. In 1947, the Air Force began a comprehensive review of emergency procedures and pilot training. The war had revealed gaps in doctrine, moments where standard procedures failed and crews had to improvise or die. The goal was to identify what had worked, codify it, and teach it to the next generation. A researcher at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base came across the after-action report from Lucky Streak's final mission. The details were sparse but striking. A co-pilot with minimal command experience had successfully landed a crippled bomber on a narrow road deep in enemy territory, saving 8 lives in the process. The researcher requested additional files. He found the debriefing transcripts from the surviving crew members. He tracked down the maintenance logs from the bomber's previous missions. He interviewed the navigator and the bombardier, both of whom were still in the service. What emerged was a portrait of an unorthodox solution to an impossible problem. Calloway had not followed standard procedure. Standard procedure would have been to bail out. Instead, he had assessed the specific variables, his crew's condition, the terrain, the fuel state, and made a calculated gamble. More importantly, he had done something that training did not emphasize. He had used the environment itself as a resource. The road was not an airfield, but it was flat and straight. It was occupied, but that also meant it was maintained. He had turned an obstacle into an opportunity. The report became a case study. It was circulated through training commands. Instructors began using it to illustrate adaptive thinking under pressure. The lesson was not that pilots should land on roads. The lesson was that doctrine could not cover every scenario, and that the best pilots were those who could recognize when the rules no longer applied. Calloway never knew about this. He was not contacted. His name appeared in internal documents but not in public accounts. The Air Force did not publicize individual cases from the war unless they involved high-profile heroics or strategic significance. A single emergency landing, however impressive, did not meet that threshold. But among a small community of test pilots, flight instructors, and aviation engineers, the story circulated. It became a touchstone. When someone questioned whether a maneuver was possible, someone else would mention the co-pilot who landed a B-24 on a German road. The details varied in the retelling, but the core remained. One person, under impossible conditions, had refused to accept the obvious outcome. In 1953, James Calloway was working at Lockheed's facility in Burbank, California. His job involved stress testing for new airframes, the kind of meticulous, unglamorous work that kept planes from falling apart at altitude. He was good at it. His colleagues respected him. He still did not talk about the war. One afternoon, an Air Force colonel visited the facility. He was there to consult on a project involving emergency ejection systems. During a meeting, he mentioned a training case study about a wartime landing. He did not use names, only the broad strokes. A crippled bomber, a narrow road, a co-pilot who had never commanded a plane in combat. Someone in the room asked if anyone knew who the pilot had been. The colonel did not. The records had been filed under the aircraft's tail number, not the crew names. It was a story, not a biography. Calloway said nothing. He let the conversation move on. Later, a colleague approached him. The man had flown B-24s during the war and knew Calloway's service record. He asked quietly if it had been him. Calloway nodded. The colleague asked why he had never mentioned it. Calloway's answer was simple. It seemed like what anyone would have done. But that was not true, and both men knew it. Most pilots, faced with the same situation, would have ordered a bailout. It was the logical choice. It was what training dictated. Staying with a dying aircraft over enemy territory was a gamble that defied reason. Except Calloway had understood something others might not have. His crew was injured, disoriented, and scattered across the fuselage. Bailing out in enemy territory with wounded men would have meant capture or death for most of them. The odds of survival were better if they stayed together, if they put the plane down intact. It was not heroism, it was arithmetic. But arithmetic performed under fire, with seconds to decide, required a kind of clarity that few people possess. The colleague pressed further. Had Calloway been afraid? Terrified, he admitted, but that didn't change what needed to be done. This is the core of his story, not fearlessness, but function despite fear, not instinct, but deliberate thought compressed into moments. Years later, historians would try to reconstruct his decision-making process. They would interview the surviving crew members, now old men with fading memories. They would analyze the flight data, the weather reports, the terrain maps. They would build models and run simulations, testing whether the landing was skill or luck. The consensus? Both. The road was there, which was luck. But recognizing it, lining up the approach, and executing the landing with damaged controls was skill. Remove either element and the crew dies. But Calloway himself never framed it that way. When asked, decades later, how he had known what to do, he said only that he had spent a lot of time reading manuals, that he had paid attention to the crew chiefs, that he had asked questions others found tedious. In other words, he had prepared. Not for that specific crisis, but for the idea that crisis was inevitable. He had built a foundation of knowledge so that when the moment came, he did not have to invent a solution from nothing. He only had to recognize which pieces fit. This is the overlooked aspect of wartime innovation. It is rarely a flash of genius. It is usually the result of unglamorous preparation, of someone who took the time to understand systems deeply enough that they could improvise when those systems failed. The recognition came late, almost too late. In 1998, a military historian named Dr. Ellen Pritchard was researching a book on unheralded moments of the air war. She had access to newly declassified files and a network of veteran contacts. One of them mentioned the Lucky Streak case study, which was still being used in modified form at the Air Force Academy. Pritchard tracked down the original after-action report. She cross-referenced it with crew records and found James Calloway's name. A search revealed that he was still alive, living in Arizona, retired from a long career in aerospace engineering. She wrote to him. He did not respond. She called. He politely declined to be interviewed. She tried a different approach. She contacted the surviving crew members. Only 2 were still alive. One, the navigator, had kept a diary during his time as a POW. In it, he had written about the landing in vivid detail. He described Calloway's hands on the yoke, the way his voice had stayed level over the intercom, the impossible geometry of a heavy bomber threading onto a country road. The navigator agreed to an interview. He spoke for 2 hours, his memory sharp on details from 50 years prior. He described the other pilots in their unit, the ones who were confident and loud, the ones everyone assumed would be heroes. And then he described Calloway, the quiet one, the one they had all underestimated. "We mocked him," the navigator said. "Not cruelly, but we didn't take him seriously. He was too cautious, too slow. We thought he'd freeze when it mattered." Instead, he had been the only one who did not freeze. Armed with this testimony, Pritchard wrote to Calloway again. This time, she included excerpts from the navigator's account. She explained that she was not interested in glorification, only accuracy. She wanted to understand how someone with his training record had performed so far beyond expectations. Calloway replied. He agreed to a single meeting on the condition that it remain private until after his death. They met in his home in Scottsdale. He was 76, still sharp, still precise in his speech. He walked her through the mission step by step, using diagrams he sketched on a notepad. He explained his reasoning at each decision point. He noted where he had been lucky, where he had miscalculated, where he had simply acted on instinct because there was no time for thought. Pritchard asked the question that mattered most. Why had he stayed calm when everything was falling apart? Calloway paused. Then he said something she would later use as the closing line of her book. Because panic is just noise, and noise doesn't solve problems. He died in 2003. Pritchard's book was published the following year. It included a full chapter on the Lucky Streak mission. The Air Force read it. So did veterans groups, aviation historians, and flight schools. In 2005, the Air Force formally recognized Calloway's actions. A medal was issued posthumously. His family accepted it at a small ceremony at Wright-Patterson. The citation noted his exceptional airmanship and decisiveness under combat conditions. But the more meaningful recognition came elsewhere. The case study, which had been taught for decades in anonymized form, was updated to include his name. New pilots at the Air Force Academy read about Second Lieutenant James Calloway, the co-pilot who was too cautious, too quiet, too slow, until the moment when caution became precision and quietness became clarity. His story became a counter-narrative to the mythos of the natural-born fighter ace. He was not a maverick. He was not reckless. He succeeded because he had done the unsexy work of preparation, because he had treated every manual and every maintenance briefing as if his life would someday depend on it. And one day, it did. The ripple effect of Calloway's landing extended beyond his own survival. In the years following the war, the Air Force conducted extensive research into emergency decision-making. The goal was to reduce casualties during the next conflict, whenever and wherever it came. The Lucky Streak case became a reference point in these studies. Researchers identified several key factors in Calloway's success. First, his technical knowledge. He understood the aircraft's systems well enough to assess what was still functional and what could be compensated for. Second, his environmental awareness. He scanned the terrain for options rather than fixating on standard procedures. Third, his risk assessment. He calculated that the danger of staying with the aircraft was lower than the danger of bailing out, given the specific conditions. These factors were integrated into updated training protocols. Pilots were taught to prioritize adaptability over rote procedure. They were encouraged to study systems beyond the minimum required knowledge. They were drilled in terrain assessment and creative problem-solving under pressure. The results were measurable. During the Korean War, the rate of successful emergency landings increased. Pilots reported feeling better prepared for off-script scenarios. Post-mission debriefs frequently cited the training emphasis on adaptive thinking. But the influence went further. Civilian aviation also took note. In the 1950s and 60s, as commercial air travel expanded rapidly, airlines faced a new challenge. Pilots trained in military discipline sometimes struggled to adapt when automation failed or when weather and mechanical issues converged. The solution was a training philosophy borrowed from military case studies, including Calloway's. Modern crew resource management, the framework that governs cockpit decision-making today, has roots in this era. The principle is simple. When systems fail, human judgment must fill the gap, and human judgment is only as good as the preparation behind it. Calloway never knew about any of this. He lived a quiet life, far from the institutions that studied his actions. But his decision on that March afternoon in 1945 became a data point in a larger evolution. It helped shift aviation culture away from the belief that great pilots were born, not made. It reinforced the idea that preparation, knowledge, and calm analysis could outperform instinct. His crew certainly understood the impact. The 8 men who survived went on to live full lives. They became teachers, engineers, salesmen, fathers. Several stayed in touch over the decades. At reunions, they would talk about the war, about the friends they lost, about the missions they flew. And they always talked about the landing, about the moment they thought they were dead, and then they were not, about the shy co-pilot who had saved them without fanfare, without hesitation, without ever asking for recognition. One of them, the bombardier, said it best in a letter written in 1989. Jim never acted like a hero, but he was one, not because he was fearless, but because he was thorough. He knew his job better than anyone gave him credit for. And when the moment came, that made all the difference. In 2011, a group of aviation students from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University traveled to Germany as part of a historical study program. Their itinerary included visits to former air bases, museums, and crash sites from the Second World War. One of the students had read Pritchard's book. He knew the approximate location where Lucky Streak had gone down. Using wartime maps and local records, the group found the road. It was still there, wider now, paved with modern asphalt. The fields on either side were cultivated with wheat. The telephone poles were gone. There was no marker, no plaque, nothing to indicate that 70 years earlier a crippled bomber had skidded to a halt there, its crew battered but alive. The students stood on the roadside and tried to imagine it. The sound of engines failing, the wind screaming through shattered glass, the ground rushing up, the impossible geometry of threading a 4-engine bomber onto a narrow strip of pavement. One of them asked the guide, a local historian, if anyone in the area remembered the incident. The guide said that a few of the oldest villagers had stories passed down from their parents. A plane had crashed or landed, depending on who told it. American soldiers had been taken prisoner. No one had died in the village, which was all that mattered at the time. The students took photographs. They measured the width of the road. They calculated the approach angle. Back at the university, they built a simulation based on the available data. They tried to replicate the landing. Most attempts ended in a crash. The margin for error was razor thin. A few degrees too steep, and the airframe broke apart. A few knots too fast, and the plane overshot into the trees. The successful runs required precise timing, exact control inputs, and a level of situational awareness that the simulation struggled to model. The conclusion was unanimous. What Callaway had done was not impossible, but it was improbable. It required skill, yes, but also a kind of focus that could not be taught, only cultivated. This is the legacy. Not that one man was extraordinary, but that preparation and clarity can produce extraordinary results, that the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the ones who ask too many questions and read too many manuals, are often the ones who solve the unsolvable. James Callaway did not set out to be a hero. He set out to be competent. He wanted to understand his aircraft, his job, his role. He did not seek glory or recognition. He simply believed that if he was going to be responsible for other people's lives, he should know how to keep them alive. That belief, applied consistently over months of training and preparation, became the foundation for 90 seconds of decisive action. And those 90 seconds saved 8 men. There is a tendency in storytelling to mythologize such moments, to frame them as destiny or fate. But the truth is more instructive. Callaway succeeded because he had done the work. He had built a reservoir of knowledge and skill that he could draw on when panic was not an option. His story is not about natural talent. It is about deliberate effort. It is about the thousands of small decisions, reading one more page, asking one more question, double-checking one more time, that accumulate into competence. And competence, when the moment demands it, becomes heroism. In the end, the shy cadet who was mocked for being too cautious, too methodical, too quiet, proved that those qualities were not weaknesses. They were strengths, hidden until the moment they were needed most. The war produced many heroes, some loud, some brash, some celebrated, but it also produced people like James Calloway, people who did not seek the spotlight, but who, when everything fell apart, became the light that others followed home. His lesson is simple. Prepare for the moment you hope never comes. Learn beyond what is required. Trust that knowledge when fear tries to drown it out. And remember that courage is not the absence of fear. It is the refusal to let fear make your decisions. Panic is just noise, and noise doesn't solve problems.